Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a former state representative from southern Minnesota, and we have, like usual, Walter Hudson, state representative from the city of Albertville. Walter, we're ending the nearing the end of session. I was wrong when I was talking about how the Democrats are going to be working in lockstep between the House and Senate, because there are 19 bills sitting in the conference committees waiting for the Democrats to hash out the differences with other Democrats. It's not a great sight for Republicans, but there's maybe a few provisions that they can work on as they twist the arms of the vulnerable Democrats in the Senate, which they hold a one-seat majority. And this is on red flag laws and things like that. Although it looks like red flag law is going to become law in Minnesota, which is the gun confiscation order for people that haven't committed a crime. There's some other stuff in the news that I wanted to talk about as well on the healthcare front. But let's just jump into it from a 50,000 foot view. How are things going in your caucus? I mean, you guys have been beaten down all session long. People you gotta just not be excited to go to caucus to hear about all the crap that the Democrats are going to pull. But what's the general feeling as you end the nearest session? Are you just looking forward for the pain to stop?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bring people down, and hopefully we can lift people back up during the course of our conversation. But it would be dishonest to say anything other than it's oppressive. It is oppressive, and especially right now, because you're right. There have been very small, tiny, marginal victories that have occurred throughout the session where we've had one provision removed or another provision removed that was just god awful. I mean, all of it's god awful. But some of the stuff that's just beyond the pale, even for some Democrats, especially in the Senate, we've been able to make progress with. I'll give you an example. This attempt in the education bill to exclude from PSEO, which is the program where you can send your high school student to attend certain college courses at a public or private institution, to exclude from that schools that have a statement of faith. So this basically targets two conservative Christian schools, Crown College and Northwestern. And we weren't able to stop it in the House because we just don't have enough of a advantage, and not that there's any advantage whatsoever, but the Senate has the one member majority. And it just so happens that it did die in the Senate because there is one senator who won't go along with it. Well, then it went to conference committee and they turned around and put it back in. And I'm telling you, like, to come here every day knowing that you're going to get curb stomped when it comes to policy, it's one thing to know that. It's another thing to have like a tiny glimmer of hope and then have it taken away from you. And that's just one example of a moment like that, which has occurred. And to complete the story, it does sound like that senator on the Democrat side is going to hold true and hopefully end up forcing them to remove that provision yet again. But the fact that that we got to fight this hard for any victory whatsoever. I'll give you another example. We had, this must have been last week. It's all blurring together at this point. The election of regents for the University of Minnesota. Well, the at-large candidate, there was two candidates in the race, one of which was nominated by Marion O'Neill, representative on our side from our caucus. And the candidate, by the way, is not a Republican by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, if anything, she is too left for the Democrats. And by that, I mean, she's primarily anti-establishment. Like, she doesn't like the way that everything is tilted. And this is my interpretation. She doesn't like the way everything's tilted towards the bureaucracy and the administrators and the bureaucrats. And so when we ended up taking two votes on that race, the first one was tied, and you have to have a majority in order to win. And so when we went to retake the vote, they called in a member who had been excused to vote remotely in order to get their candidate across the finish line. And it's like, really, like, you guys, that's not even like a huge victory for us. Like, we get to have one regent who isn't bought in completely to the status quo, isn't even like one of our people, isn't a right-wing ideologue by any stretch of the imagination, but just isn't totally bought into the status quo. You're not going to let us have that. It's so petty, the extent to which they're willing to leverage the slim grasp on power that they have to affect the most ridiculous decisions and policies imaginable.
Yeah. Well, on your first point about the post-secondary enrollment options, or the PSEO, I mean, that is a fantastic program. I don't know if you went to the PSA or through the PSEO program. I did too. I went to public school in Brainerd. I went to private school for a couple of years, but then my senior year, I went back to Brainerd, and they helped me get enrolled in the University of Minnesota, and actually moved down here moved to the cities when I was 17 years old, and lived on my own, and went to the University of Minnesota for my senior year at high school. And it was, it's a great program. There are thousands and thousands of Minnesota kids that complete 1 or 2 years of college by the time they graduate high school. That is a means to make college more affordable too. But to restrict that in any way was really an attack on kids that are trying to further their education. And I'm glad. I hope it can be pulled out again, because that would help the program, especially. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is in the news, the Mayo Clinic. Well, actually, we've seen all of corporate Minnesota, which has been going along with the Democrat plans. You can see that you went to the chamber dinner, and the different organizations that love this, that have become woke and love the Democrat agenda. All of a sudden, we realized they were pretending to follow along, and when the Democrats actually crammed through this stuff, corporate Minnesota is kind of reeling and like, whoa, wait a minute, right? The paid family leave, which they talked about supporting, now all of a sudden it's an enormous tax on employers, and they're going to have to make cuts. We saw the $15 minimum wage that employers talk about. Now the Minneapolis Federal Reserve put out a report saying that they cut like 29% of the jobs in retail because of that $15 minimum wage. And corporate, and even we see schools at the Capitol testifying against the paid family leave program and how it's going to hurt schools. So then we finally have some pushback. And then now recently, the Mayo Clinic is pushing back and saying, look, if you're going to put these mandates on hospitals with this nursing ratio business, the Mayo Clinic is going to take $4 billion that it was going to invest in Minnesota and put it in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates, Arizona, Florida. In other words, not in Minnesota. And that is going to really hurt jobs, especially down here in southern Minnesota. And they even went so far as to say it's 4 times the investment that the Vikings made in Minnesota, right? Remember the Vikings? They were like, oh, we're going to leave Minnesota unless you give us our stadium. Not a lot of people didn't like that. This is different. This is healthcare. It's a different industry, but probably a little more essential than the Vikings. But they're holding us hostage. Is it right? Is it wrong? Or is it just highlighting how destructive these nursing standards are going to be on hospitals and patient care?
Well, first of all, with the comparison to the Viking Stadium, I appreciate what they're trying to say when they say, "Hey, look, we're talking about an investment that's 4 times what the Vikings had on offer." But it's also 2 extremely different situations, because in the case of the Vikings, they were arm twisting and blackmailing, basically, in order to get something paid for by the state of tremendous value, which is, I think, reprehensible. Um, and in the case of Mayo, they're saying, "Leave us the hell alone." Those are 2 very different messages. And the latter, by the way, has been characterized as a quote unquote threat by the real aggressors in this situation, which is the Democrats in Minnesota. No, you're not being threatened. When you tell somebody we're coming in to harm you, we're going to come slit your throat. When that's your message to them, for them to say, no, we're just going to leave, if that's your attitude towards us, that's not them threatening you. That's them defending themselves. The morality of this issue couldn't be more clear. And it's actually quite hilarious and just awe-inspiring to watch as not only the Democrats generally, but in particular Representative Andy Smith, who is the representative that has the Mayo Clinic in his district, has just been engaged in open warfare against Mayo, which is not only the largest employer in his district, but the largest private employer in the state of Minnesota and a marquee employer in the region and in the nation. It's known worldwide, and you're going up against them. Now, me and him had this back and forth a little bit on Twitter, and he characterizes what I'm saying right now as being sold out for big corporations. I've said nothing but, you just heard what I had to say about the Vikings, right? It's not about corporation, individual, the type of entity you are. It's about right versus wrong. All right. When you are going after an organization that employs the most people in this state, other than the state of Minnesota itself, on the basis that they ought to slit their own throat for the sake of your political revolutionary ideas, to the effect of detrimentally impacting patient care, because that's what this provision will do. The provision in question is mandating nurse to patient staffing ratios. Well, that's a cutesy way of telling patients, hold your arm tight and go home, right? As the bleeding, right? Like, you're not going to get the care that you need because we're capped out on the number of patients that we can have because of the amount of nursing staffing we have at this time. It's absolutely fascinating to watch them make that argument when this is the same party that tells us in every other instance that no man should be left behind and that the lowest of the lowly needs to be lifted up. And we need to house everybody, and we need to clothe everybody, and we need to feed everybody. Here they are explicitly saying people who need healthcare shouldn't get it if it makes nurses uncomfortable.
Well, in just you're right in pointing this out. They're mandating a higher ratio for the nurses. Obviously, the nurses union is pushing this because they want to increase their pay and increase their demand, even though there's already a nursing shortage. And the Mayo Clinic isn't a hospital that just has people stacked up in hallways dying. I mean, the Mayo Clinic has an extremely high quality, high level of care, and it's places that people seek to get care if they don't like their current hospital, their local hospital. People travel from all over the world to go there. And so the Mayo has figured out how to offer care in the best manner they can. And putting these new staffing ratios on it just doesn't work for the Mayo. In fact, Mayo is one of the only hospitals in the state that's not union. Their nurses at the hospital are not part of the union. The Mayo Clinic Health System that owns a bunch of hospitals here in southern Minnesota, including two small towns near the side of me, they have nurses that are in the union, but the Mayo Clinic doesn't. And they just want to be left alone and to continue to operate under their same model that they have. And they're pushing back on Walz, making demands that he kill this bill. And the nurses have started a sit-in in front of Walz's office to try to force him to get this bill through.
Yeah, I've walked past that. It's adorable. I presume that patients are being well cared for while their nurses are down here protesting to take care away from them. Just seem like fantastic people. Really, really glad that they're doing that. Yeah, I mean, to me, this whole thing is just, and I don't understand how a bigger deal isn't being made out of it, even with the media that we have, because it's when you have, like I say, the largest private employer in the state saying we're going to divest from the state, and also just the implications of the attack on the quality of care. And you know what? I'm gonna actually be generous with the media, because I actually have seen, Blois Olson in particular is someone who I've retweeted twice this week, which is 2 times more than I typically do in any given week. And it's not because I don't regard Blois as particularly antagonistic towards Republicans or conservatives, but he's not generally echoing our talking points either, right? But in this case, even he's coming out and saying, you guys, like, how really you're tilting against Mayo? Like, you're blaming Mayo for telling you that if you put them into a financially untenable situation, that they're going to take their finances elsewhere. You do understand we're free, right? You do understand that people have the right to relocate their business, their residence, their capital. They can go somewhere else because this isn't East Germany. We don't have a Berlin Wall, right? So when you have even the likes of Blois Olson making that case, it kind of goes with the theme that you started with, is that it seems like at least rhetorically, people are waking up, institutions are waking up. I haven't talked to the chambers, but certainly if you look at the scoreboard in terms of legislation, it's all, for the most part, been tilting against their desires. And so you got to imagine that privately there's conversations that are taking place in a lot of these institutions saying, you know what, we got some serious buyer's remorse here and it's time to make a change.
Yeah, and you mentioned retweeting Blois, and I too retweeted him for the first time in a long time. And I looked at the tweet, and he says, for those in the capital, those with capital, meaning money, are more mobile than ever, people and employers. It's not the threats. It's the reality that some don't understand leaving Minnesota or moving money is a daily consideration that wasn't previously a frequent thought. I retweeted it, saying that in 2023, we have the most mobile remote workforce in history. And for a dual income, work for home married couple, their entire mortgage payment for a home in a low tax state could be paid for with the tax savings of a residency change, right? I mean, I work remotely for my job. I work for an Iowa insurance company, and I could do work anywhere. And for a lot of us who work remotely, one of the only things that's keeping us here is a family nearby, kids in school. But for corporations looking to not just move to Minnesota, but to expand their current operations, if they have operations in another state, they're going to put that money elsewhere and those jobs elsewhere and slowly transition out of the state. It's a reality, and Democrats need to wake up. Now they look at the numbers of people moving to Minnesota. Minnesota has had a net increase in people, or somewhat stayed the same. But when you look at the tax revenue that's coming from the people in our state, you see that the majority of people moving to Minnesota are low-income individuals who are on Minnesota's social programs, and the people that are leaving are the higher income earners. So Minnesota is losing revenue at the same time that Democrats are increasing the percentage of taxes people have to pay and increasing the spending. In other words, the demand on revenue to the state, which just won't be there.
Yeah, I mean, we really are circling around what needs to be the vision for Minnesota moving forward. And that is, we need our public policy to foster, encourage, and reward two things: productivity and virtue. Currently, we're on a path towards punishing productivity and virtue in order to facilitate distribution and maintain control. Those are the two offers on the table: distribution and control versus productivity and virtue. And it's no wonder, because we don't have Berlin walls in the United States of America yet, because we allow people to move from state to state and to vote with their feet, you are, of course, naturally going to see a migration of people who are productive and virtuous out of a state which is punishing them for being those things. And as that happens, you're going to have less resources at hand in order to redistribute and control. And it's not theoretical. We've seen it happen before, right? Like, I was born in Detroit. I grew up in the ashes of these types of policies. You have people who've migrated here, the Hmong community, right? You've had people who have migrated here from places that tried this stuff and it failed, and it resulted in not just tyranny, but starvation and deprivation. And so they, by the grace of God, were able to get away from that and escape it. And now here it is blooming in the state of Minnesota. It's bad for everyone too. That's the thing, is it's not just this whole idea of, oh, it's selfish. And by the way, that's the feedback, the pushback that you get against the likes of Mayo, right? And we'll talk about Fairview and Sanford here in a second, I'm sure. Is that, oh, they're just being selfish. Oh, they're being exploitative. Um, no, you're first of all, they're the ones who are actually providing care for people in need. You're not. Legislators aren't doing that. We're not saving lives down here in St. Paul. Okay. Mayo actually is. Fairview and Sanford, they actually are. All right. So we don't get to stand in moral judgment. We have no moral standing to be judging them on that basis. But secondarily, the it is in the pursuit to it is in production, which is inherently a self-interested pursuit. The reason why you do things, make things, build things, create things, accumulate things is because you are interested in doing that. If you weren't, then you wouldn't. We need to pursue our self-interest through production, through virtue. Otherwise, we're not going to have the resources at hand to be generous and helpful and to bring people up and to come alongside them. That's the thing, is that this isn't a contest between the people who want to help and the people who don't. This is a contest between the people who are able to help and the people who aren't, right? This is a contest between the people who know how help is made possible versus the ones who think you can just write a law to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, I want to I want to get into the free college for everybody bill. That's the free college for some groups bill. But let's touch on the Fairview issue, because that's been in the news now for a year, where the University of Minnesota sold its hospital to Fairview, or sold this clinic to Fairview, which grew it. And now Fairview wants to sell it to Sanford. Is that is that understanding correct?
That's correct.
And so University of Minnesota is saying, no, we don't want Sanford. We want to buy it back or block the sale. And again, meddling in a private business decision. But how is Keith Ellison involved in this? He's trying to block it as well?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, I don't have all of the details of the interaction, but my basic top level understanding is that the bill that was passed off the House floor this week empowers Attorney General Keith Ellison with the ability to just decide that the merger isn't going to happen, on the basis of the merger being anti-competitive and monopolistic, which is an interesting argument to make when, even under the premise where that's true, where this is somehow a monopoly, it's not. But even under the premise where that's true, if your choice is between a monopoly and nothing, then monopoly is probably a better choice, especially when you're talking about a healthcare provider, right? And that's really where we're at. As a result of this, Keith Ellison can and likely will stop the Sanford merger from happening, because it's a really passionate lefty issue amongst their activist base. They hate Sanford because it's from South Dakota, and because South Dakota is a conservative state, and because the people who own Sanford are conservative Christians. So for that reason, they don't want to see this merger take place, because they're afraid that somehow Sanford's going to be able to affect conservative healthcare policies, in spite of the fact that the operations take place in a jurisdiction where we've decided that we're going to pour unlimited gallons of infant blood into the altar of Baal. So they don't want this to happen, and as a result, Fairview is left to just remain insolvent and keep bleeding until it dies. And so you're looking at the prospect, the very real prospect, of the Fairview health system collapsing. In which case there's just not going to be clinics, right? I mean, if it totally collapses and there's nobody there to pick up the pieces, then it's just not going to exist.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a huge problem.
It's hard to imagine that competition within the 7-county metro area for hospitals is that dire. But for those who don't follow health policy, the legislature actually has authority to approve whether or not an existing hospital can add more beds, can expand. So there's and even with hospitals like the University of Minnesota and Fairview, who have purchased hospitals and then shuttered them or shrunk them, they get to maintain that bed space that they had as banked space. And then the legislature can't approve new beds for other hospitals because there's banked beds that maybe Fairview or the University of Minnesota has. It's really controlling. They're not allowing hospitals to make the decisions that are best for the viability of their clinic and their doctors and nurses and patients, and that government is constantly meddling. this is the Democrats that love this, the ones that say that they want to get government out of the doctor's office are continuing to regulate and overregulate clinics. So there's a deep hypocrisy in this. I want to jump to this bill coming out of conference committee, the higher ed bill, that they've realized that there's all of a sudden declining enrollment the last few years. I don't know what that could be, maybe COVID, but they want to increase enrollment in public state colleges and universities. So how do they do that? How do they increase enrollment? They give it away for free to anybody who's in a family that has an income less than $90,000. I think is the cap. $80,000. So if you're a working couple, you've got some high school age kids that are going to go off to college, and you make $85,000 a year. If you can go and beg your boss for a pay cut for $5,000, you can get your college paid for free to Minnesota State colleges and universities, University of Minnesota system. So at $25,000 a year for 3 kids, that's about $300,000 for 3 kids to go to college that you have to pay if you make $85,000 a year. But if you make $79,999, you're going to get it paid for free by all the rest of the taxpayers who make $85,000 a year and have to pay for their own kids plus yours.
Yeah, I mean, this bounces very well off of the point that I just made regarding the role of productivity and virtue in a society. This is a policy that explicitly, as you outline, disincentivizes productivity and virtue. Because indeed, consider that transaction, and it doesn't even have to be $85,000. It could be literally $8,000 or $80,000 right on the nose. If you're making $80,000, you don't qualify to have free tuition for your kids for 2 or 4 years, like the whole deal. If you make $79,999, you do. Now let's just think through the math on that, right? Like how much is the tuition to send your kid to school for 4 years? Let's say it's $40,000.
What, $25,000 a year at the university?
$25,000 a year. Okay, so you're talking about $100,000. So would it be worth it for you to make $1 less or $5,000 less in order to get a value that equals $100,000? Of course it would. But what's the inherent problem with that? When you have people across the state making that value calculation, the result is less production, less building of value, building of wealth. Now, this free tuition, quote unquote, is not actually free. It does come from the state coffers, which are fed by income taxes and sales taxes. So if there's less production, if people are making less, if they're incentivized to do less and build less, there's going to be less available to pay for this and literally every other public good that is appropriated for the state.
Yeah. And to further exacerbate this, somebody making $80,000 a year is going to be paying for their neighbors' kids if their family makes $79,000 a year. So it's not just the struggle that, people that make more than $80,000 have to pay for their kids to go to college, but now they have to pay for other people's kids to go to college. And it's just, it's just such a kick in the teeth in setting this at, a hard stop at $80,000. Well, I mean, first of all, it's kind of like the free lunch program for all kids. There are already programs out there to discount tuition, all these grants from the state and federal government, scholarships. There is so much money out there for disadvantaged kids to go to college. And then you also have to think, just because your parents make $80,000 doesn't mean that they're actually going to be paying anything for you to go to college, right? There are a lot of parents that are like, they're struggling at 80,000 and they're not going to give you anything. You need to go get loans anyways. So using the parents as this tool to say, well, if they make 80,000, then you don't get anything. I mean, that's just wrong too. It's all around a terrible program, but it sets us in a really bad path. It's just more spending on so many programs, but this is it's going to basically pit people in the $80,000 family income bracket against people in the 70s. And it's just not good for our society. It's definitely not one Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, So to expound upon your scenario, not only is the guy next door who's making 80,000 going to have to pay to send your kids to school because you're making 79,999, he's also left with the burden of sending his kids to school. So he's paying for both yours and his.
Yeah.
Also think about the guy who let's say he would have qualified. He makes 79,999, but his last kid just got through college before this gets enacted. And so now he's got to pay for people in his financial peer group to send their kids to school after having just foot the bill for his own kids. And then you've got people who never went to college at all, have no need for college, aren't sending their kids to college because their kid is starting a business or going into trade school or whatever, or paying for it on their own, God forbid, right? Who are now going to have to pay for all of their neighbors to send their kids to college. I mean, there is no scenario that isn't a taking from one Minnesotan to give to another Minnesotan for no reason whatsoever. Like
Yeah.
this isn't redistribution from the wealthy to those in need. This is, in some cases, as we just outlined, redistribution from people on the same or even disproportionately lower financial level, funding the education of people that are either lateral to them or above them, theoretically, in some cases. This is
Yeah.
just absolute insanity and
It,
nonsense, but
it,
it's on brand.
to throw another scenario, a couple who are each making $35,000, so they're making 70 grand a year, or maybe they're making just over $80,000 a year together. Not only do they have to pay for their kids, but then their neighbors who make a combined income of $130,000. The husband just quits his job to stay at home so that they can drop their income below $80,000, and
Yeah,
they openly brag about it at the neighborhood barbecue.
absolutely. And again, the quitting of the job in that scenario is the lowering of productivity. So to the extent that those types of decisions are made, you are lowering the GDP of the state, which is where from which you derive your revenue. It's unsustainable on its face, and these people just don't care. The only thing that matters to them is the insane ideology and whether or not something feels good or looks good or will potentially help them in an election somewhere. That is all they care about. The actual practical utility of how these policies impact the state as a whole and individuals in particular is nowhere on their radar.
Yeah, and I want to also let people know that this is open to anybody in the country that moves to Minnesota and becomes a resident can then qualify for this. So
Yeah,
you're also attracting people from all over the country to come to our state for free college tuition. And it's just unheard of. I mean, I remember when I lived in Los Angeles and I wanted to enroll in UCLA, you had to be there for, I think, 2 years, a resident, 2 years to get in-state tuition, which was a third of what it was for outstate tuition. Minnesota, no, you're gonna be able to come here, get your transgender surgery, go enroll in the University of Minnesota, get welcome, roll out the welcome mat for all these social programs. In addition to spending tons of money on this, the Democrats got some really good news this week. Republicans have agreed to, or it sounds like Republicans are going to agree to a bonding bill, which would allow the state to borrow $1.5 billion more. Now, we've got an $18 billion surplus, money that we didn't need. The Republicans have agreed to borrow $1.5 billion more so that Democrats can spend it on some programs that may include a tax cut, a tax cut to people, or maybe increase the amount of the checks going out. But they're going to spend $1.5 billion more because the Republicans have to be part of the action. You guys are probably caucus this, or what's the feeling right? I mean, House Republicans are probably going to support a bonding bill. Is that right?
Well, look, not much has changed on bonding from the last time you and I talked about it. And the last time you and I talked about it, I wasn't able to provide you with like a clear position on where the caucus is at because it's all over the map depending upon who you talk to. And that is still the case. Like this is the one issue where there just isn't, there's a wide spectrum of positions for bonding and against bonding. And I think it would be, I think people would be surprised where certain folks of note who they regard to be this, that, or the other thing on the ideological spectrum, where they land on this issue. But I'll tell you what bothers me about the whole thing. This is the way the process is run with bonding. It is, I believe, intentionally a form of extortion that is particularly weighted towards penalizing Republicans and more specifically, the constituents within Republican-controlled districts. So, for example, my community, as you well know, we've talked about before, has this need for a wastewater treatment plant in St. Michael. Now, albeit, as you've noted, and I agree, that need was created artificially by mandates from the state. The fact remains that it is a need and it needs to get done. And it's been delayed for political reasons for a number of years now, much to the frustration of the people of St. Michael and certainly the leadership and administration of the city of St. Michael. So the way this shakes out, and we'll see what happens, because it's been every day and every hour of each day, the story has changed regarding where we're at on bonding and what the ultimatums are from Speaker Hortman and what have you. But if this thing shakes out to where it comes down to, and we talked about the scenario last time, it comes down to it passes or fails based on my vote. In that moment, what I'm going to have to decide is whether or not I enable that wastewater treatment plant to finally go through and be built, or I say no as a form of protest against the process and at the cost of not getting that wastewater treatment plant. Now, by contrast, the reason why I say this is particularly weighted against Republicans is that no Democrat is going to be faced with that choice, because the things that Democrats bond for are not essential pieces of infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants. Democrats bond for nonsense like opera houses and sculpture gardens and things like that, things that nobody needs, and things that aren't going to win or lose them elections or hurt or enhance communities. Foo-foo nonsense. And on top of that, Democrats are in control, so they can just spend money on whatever they want to spend it on. They can pass a cash bill and just finance capital improvements in their districts and leave ours to starve and leave our people to suffer. And so this is a form of extortion that, just like any type of hostage scenario, you end up being faced with the moral dilemma of what's the cost benefit to your community. And I don't know how that's going to sort out. We'll see where the cookie crumbles. But I think that the takeaway from this situation properly ought to be, one, elections have consequences, and we damn well better get our act together so that we can get these people out of power. But then two, when we do have power, we need to change the way this process works. We need to have, and again, you'd be surprised by the people who agree with me on this. We need to have effectively single subject bonding bills. And by that, I don't mean have a bill for my wastewater treatment plant, but have a bill for the category of wastewater treatment plants, and then have a bill for the category of sculpture gardens, and then have a bill for the category of whatever else is in these bonding bills, instead of having this giant omnibus. Because what the omnibus does is it creates the mechanism for that blackmail, for that extortion, to force people to vote on something that is financially irresponsible and that they don't actually support.
Yeah. Well, I got to weigh in too, because you brought up the Democrats vote for opera houses. I mean, Dean Erdahl, who's the chair of bonding for many years, loves his opera house in Litchfield, and his wife's on the board there, and always manages to get $100,000 or $200,000 in the bonding bill for his opera house. Republicans like crap in the bill too, but when it comes to wastewater treatment, wastewater in drinking water, storm water, drains, that kind of stuff, the projects are all scored based on their need for their community, whether the community can afford to pay for it itself, or not, and then how much damage it's causing. Do they not have clean water? Are they dumping raw sewage into rivers and things like that? everything is scored. And then the projects with the greatest need are put at the top. And so the PFA funding, which is the money that funds all this stuff, they might get $300 million or $20 million in the bonding bill, and then it goes down the priority pecking list. It's the earmarks that legislators put in for stuff that actually isn't a need. It's a want. That is what people want to get that is what people are arguing about to get their projects in the bonding bill. But the same thing goes for roads. They put money into the road fund, and it goes down the top priority of the roads that are the most dire, the most degraded, that get the most use or are most essential for transportation. Those get funded. So the legislature really doesn't need to do anything other than just fund transportation and wastewater. The idea that if Republicans don't vote for a bill, that their wastewater project doesn't get funded, that's BS. Because if their project is truly a need in a nonpartisan way, this formula works, their project will get funded, because if it is indeed a need. But if their city has the money or can pay for it, but would rather have the state pay for it, which of course every community is going to say, then their project gets earmarked in a bonding bill because they need votes across the aisle to pass it. And so they literally will come to your office and say, I got $50 million to spend on crap that is non-essential. I'll give you $3 million, $2 million. What do you need for your community? And that's just a terrible way of creating the process. Pat Garofalo, who isn't my kind of conservative, loves this idea of breaking the bonding bill into 5 different bills. But Republicans had control of the House and Senate, and they didn't do it. They had the largest bonding bill in history of Minnesota that passed when Republicans controlled both. And there was crap like the Jolly Green Giant Museum just south of me that Rosen put in there. It's like, this is not, these aren't essential needs, and it is not fair to force all taxpayers to pay for some pet project for your district. That's just wrong. So, but this idea that Republicans are going to vote for it because Democrats aren't going to include projects in their district, they'll include the essential ones, but it's the non-essential ones that are going to get included to buy your votes.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, I'm very interested in following up with you on that formula and how it works, because that's not something that I've heard before, probably on purpose. Nobody's told me that. And then secondarily, on the topic of, yes, the Republicans were in control before and they didn't do it. Can't dispute that. What I can tell you is that when we thought we were going to have the red wave, when they were all but measuring the curtains in this place to take the majority, there was broad agreement amongst the candidates and members, and even from then leadership, including Kurt Dowd, that we were going to make those types of changes. Now, obviously, we didn't get the opportunity to make good on that, and so I can't tell you with any certainty whether or not it actually would have happened. But there certainly seemed to be a broad sense that those types of reforms and changes, doing things single subject, was something that people cared about and would have been on board with. So hopefully we'll get the opportunity to live up to that at some point.
Yeah. And for those curious about our wastewater funding discussion, because you just, live and breathe wastewater funding. If you just go to Google and you type in PFA funding MN rank, you'll get the report. It's a PDF. That's an estimated funding needs report that goes through all the projects, how they're scored, which ones are most important, how many millions of dollars that are needed, how much the community is asked to match for this grant. And it's a really interesting read. But again, I harp on Minnesota agencies all the time, but MnDOT and the PFA, they put together really good reports and do really good nonpartisan analysis on all these projects in our state to figure out what the needs are. Stuff goes to the legislature and gets just hyper political, but there's some absolute needs out there, and the projects to improve the state. When the state owns a building, they should maintain it and just not let it degrade. And so there's work to be done. Roofing on projects and state-owned properties, also a need. But to build new buildings or to build a new parking ramp or whatever new stuff, maybe should be scrutinized. But if we have a huge surplus, they want to spend cash on a bill, let them spend cash. But they're going to put money in the PFA fund. They're going to put money into roads. and then the roads that are the most, nonpartisan, that are the most dire to spend money on, those will get funded first, regardless if Republicans vote for the bill or not. So, again, it's hard to explain this to the public, but I've talked with constituents that are like, you voted against the bonding bill. Yeah, but I got my project, into the bill, or this project is already going to be funded regardless if it's earmarked or not, because it is absolutely an essential need. And so, but I don't think that the constituents of one city in my district should be paying for an indoor swimming pool in another city, because I don't
Right.
think the swimming pool is an essential need.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be perusing this now.
Yeah. All right. Well, what else do we have to cover for the listeners, Walter, to give them a good snapshot of where things are at? Legislature is going to be done on the 22nd of May. It's at a Monday. The business can't be performed on the last day of the legislature, so that would be May 21st. A Sunday is the last day that you can be voting. They'll keep you there until quote unquote midnight. And if it gets to be after midnight, they usually hang a cloth over the clock so you can't see what time it is. But it may go until Sunday at midnight. But I've also heard that you may get done a couple days early.
Yeah, yeah. This is another thing that is clear as mud. So Jamie Long, the majority leader in the House, apparently said in Rules Committee yesterday that their plan is to be done by the 18th, which I think is a Friday. And that there's different ways of interpreting that. One way is that that's just them trying to twist the arms of their own conference committees to get them to finish up, so that they can at least get done on time, quote unquote, by the 22nd. The other way to look at it is that they legitimately do want to get done early so that they can spike the football and do this victory lap about how efficient state government is under Democrats. And as it turns out, yeah, when you don't allow anybody to testify, when you start doing a bunch of things that you told nobody you were going to do, when you start inserting things into conference committee reports that weren't part of either bill, like providing free college tuition to kids whose families make less than $80,000 a year. Yeah, it can go pretty quickly when you don't follow a deliberative democratic process, when you just act like reckless tyrants and do whatever you want. Things can go pretty quick. So I don't think that political talking point is going to go quite as well for them as they think it is if we end up getting done early, because we're just going to be able to point at what they did and be like, yeah, when you take dad's car and you drive it 100 miles an hour down a 2-lane country road with hills, you can get somewhere fast, but it's going to come back with a few scratches at the very least. And you know, if you like that, if you like the outcomes, if you like the fact that your taxes are being raised by $10 billion when we have a $17.5 billion surplus, then I suppose getting it done quickly is something you will also like. But if you're opposed to that stuff, if you don't like the fact that your schools are going to have to teach ethnic studies and redistribute power and resources based along racial lines, if you don't like the fact that the Fairview health system is collapsing and that Mayo is divesting from the state, if you don't like the fact that they're banning 80% of modern energy production, then them doing those things really quickly probably isn't frosting on the cake for you.
Let's talk about guns. So the public safety bill is in conference committee. It does look like there is going to be some type of red flag law that passes. And again, this is a bill that allows the police to come and take guns away from someone who hasn't committed a crime and hasn't even been accused of committing a crime. But and usually they do this using no-knock warrants, which they don't want to give someone time to arm themselves, so they like to just come storming in someone's house in order to take their guns, as what happened with Amir Locke. Was it Amir Locke? Is that the guy?
Yeah.
So there's been some criticism of no-knock warrants. I don't like no-knock warrants. I think they're unconstitutional. But there's also a almost complete ban of no-knock warrants. And I know I messaged someone this morning to see if the ban on no-knock warrants would also prohibit them from using a no-knock warrant to confiscate guns. So is it actually, maybe we'd get some Republicans that would support the ban on no-knock warrants. But we'll see. It doesn't seem to be. It sounds like it would be applied to no-knock warrants, so they would have to knock on your door and issue a warrant to take your guns, which would be it would help keep police out of being put into these situations that are really really dire.
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard for me to untangle that because I voted against the prohibition of no-knock warrants and am very much a supporter of the idea of using them. And my reasons for that position are that they work. You look at these high-profile cases, the Amir locks and what have you. They're very much the exception to the rule. There was a KSTP story. I can't remember the exact time frame, but it was a couple years ago where they looked at like a 5 month uh, span of time, and in that time, 70 no-knock warrants were issued in the state of Minnesota. 70. And out of those, I want to say it was like 29, somewhere around there, that were actually executed as no-knock warrants. And what that means is that the officers who were administering the warrant applied their professional judgment to the scenario, to the situation that they encountered at the scene, and determined whether or not it was in the best interest of all parties concerned, including the people who are potentially in the home or the premises, to execute the warrant as a no-knock or to provide some sort of announcement that they were there. And most of the time, in that time period, they decided to announce that they were there. And so I think the idea of giving officers that flexibility, because what you're really saying there is you're saying, look, if in your professional judgment, and this has to be signed off on by a judge, by the way, right? So evidence has to be considered. But what the warrant does is it doesn't mandate that you have to kick in the door and not announce yourself. It's saying if you believe, based upon the circumstances that you encounter at the scene, that announcing yourself is going to place you and the folks in the premises and the public around in greater danger than you not announcing, then you have the option to not announce. I think that is not only an ability that the police ought to have, but it's an ability that they often choose not to use, even when they do have it. And most of the time, it works out because what we didn't have in that 5 month period is 70 atrocities or 70 disasters, 70 national news stories. We had one, which was Amir Locke. And so, I don't think that it is. And as far as the constitutionality of it, I would argue that due process, and I think this was a conversation we actually did have in committee, because that was the argument of the author, Representative Curran, that this was unconstitutional. And if you take the concept of warrant out of consideration and you just look at the action itself, kicking in somebody's door without announcing yourself, yeah, that's unconstitutional if it's unwarranted. So is showing up and announcing yourself and taking me into custody and dragging me off to jail if it's unwarranted, right? So is searching my car or my premises or my person without a warrant, without probable cause. Those are unconstitutional actions. But when you do have warrant, when you do have probable cause, when there is a reason for it, and it can rationally and lawfully be explained as something that is genuinely serving the public interest of upholding the law, then it becomes constitutional. That's what a warrant is.
Well, but
And
let's put this into perspective. If red flag laws pass and no knock warrants are allowed, now you're sending police to someone's house who have not committed a crime and
right.
who's, a boss, like an employer, has said, "Hey, I'm going to fire Bob, and he got divorced and he's broke and he's filing bankruptcy, and I think he's got guns, and I think he's gonna, be dangerous. So why don't you go take his guns away?" There's no due process there. And then the police are going to show up and kick in the guy's door at 3 a.m. Maybe he's sleeping next to his gun. And we haven't more. I mean, Amir Locke was happened in Minnesota, but there's been cases in other states where police have kicked in the wrong door and shot the wrong person who was lawfully defending themselves. And it puts police in a greater danger. And it used to be that there was, first of all, if there's a kidnapping or a hostage situation, there's already reason that you can do a no-knock warrant. You have probable cause, but to for other reasons, for trying to capture drugs before someone has, flushes them down the toilet. Those are not reasons to use no-knock warrants. So I've been against it, and I've been talking to Republicans saying, look, you're going to support no-knock warrants right up until the time they pass red flag laws, and then what? It's scary.
Well, I definitely appreciate what you're attempting to do here by linking the two. Unfortunately for your effort, it's like the script is being completely flipped, because simultaneously no-knock warrants are going away and red flag laws are being implemented. So it's like the worst of both worlds. So yeah, it's going to be a fun time in Minnesota.
Well, a public safety bill, I mean, we've got, what did I say, 19 bills or something in conference committee, or the pot bills in the joint conference committee. That one will, they'll come out and be signed into law soon. I'm sure Republicans they have some people on these conference committees, but your voice is unfortunately not necessary to work out the differences in these bills. They'll be signed into law. I'm looking forward to doing some after session wrap up podcast. We can go through some of these bills to really see what was in it and see what was snuck into it at the last minute. So I know we're over time, Walter. You got any final thoughts?
Just that I'm about to go back into the belly of the beast cat session in 15 minutes. So
great.
I'm tired.
Thank you everybody for tuning in to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. We'll see you next week. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.